Okay.
Hi, everybody. I'm delighted to introduce you to Alan Rubel, who is a professor of philosophy and the director of the information school at the University of Wisconsin. I apologize for my attire. It is past midnight here in Sydney, but it is something like early morning or not too early morning in Wisconsin, where Alan is. And he's very kindly agreed to meet with us. Alan, thank you so much for your time, and I'm really excited to be asking you some questions today.
Thanks for the invitation, Mark. It's always fun to talk about work with you, and I'm looking forward to it. And thanks for meeting at such a late hour.
Great. So we actually met in the Netherlands when you came to visit Delft University of Technology, where I was associate professor. And you came to the workshop at the Bielefeld, what is it called? Institute for Advanced Study, where we talked about explainable artificial intelligence. Can you say a little bit about how you got interested in this, given your background?
Sure. So my background, as you mentioned, is in philosophy. I'm also a lawyer, but my primary academic appointment is in the information school at University of Wisconsin. And the information school considers lots of different questions about the intersection of people and computing and information technologies. And so, my research before I got this job was on privacy and surveillance in a number of contexts. But as I moved into this job, that started to really get me interested in the ways that lots of different information and computational technologies affect people, not only in terms of privacy, but in terms of other kinds of interests that they have. So it was sort of a natural fit, and the opportunity to go work with people at Delft and elsewhere in the Netherlands at the other TUs and workshop at Bielefeld was just a way to expand what I'd kind of already been working on, and learning a lot from people, you among them, who are also considering the ways in which new computational and information technologies affect people, affect social norms, affect society more broadly. So yeah, it was sort of inherent questions, and the tools that I can deploy are based on my legal and philosophical training.
Awesome. Well, so your paper that I assigned for this class kind of flips the script on moral patient versus moral agent, which is to say, like, most of the work on ethical issues and moral issues related to algorithmic decision-making focuses on the people and populations that are affected by this decision-making. So it's like, I don't get a loan, or I get a fine, or whatever nasty thing happens to me, I don't get out of jail. And what your paper does is to ask, like, well, what happens with the agents who are actually using these technologies, and how do they deploy and operate them, and how does this shift the analysis that we need to give from, like, just thinking about what it would be like to suffer from an algorithm making a bad decision about you, to being the sort of person or being in the role where you're required to use an algorithm that might make decisions that harm people. So I'm curious, how did you get to that position in the paper, and why do you think that is a valuable perspective?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I appreciate your sort of describing that way as a shift, and it is. I'm gonna answer in a couple of parts. I'm gonna sort of answer as to sort of how me and my co-authors, Clinton Castro and Adam Pham, got to that point as you asked, and I'll describe a little bit about how we've taken that a little further in some subsequent work, and then why that'll help explain why it matters, or I think it matters. There's lots of different kinds of cases out there that you're familiar with, recommender systems or inexplicable, inscrutable systems, or, you talked about just the sheer exercise of power over people in circumstance where something big is at stake, a loan, incarceration, and conditions of supervision within a criminal justice system, things like that. And yeah, that's really, really important. But sometimes when you dive down into cases, it's not obvious. Something will stick in your craw, so to speak. Something will bother you in the back of your mind and just seems off, seems wrong, but it's not clear either what that wrong is, if there is one, right? It's always worth considering whether there is something going on there that's bad or unjustifiable or could be better. But you can't identify an entity necessarily for whom it is wrong, right? So I think there's lots of cases where actions might be bad or structures might be developed that are likely to be bad, but where we can't identify a person for a discrete individual for whom it is bad. They may be there, they may be hard to identify, or maybe it's not that bad. And so, we started, Clinton, Adam, and I started talking about some cases, including this Facebook case in which there was a automated advertising system that recommended ways for people to build bigger advertising groups based on information that people would put into Facebook and what the person trying to advertise a good or service was trying to do, and it was able, in an automated way was able to grow the audience for grow a racist audience for whatever target advertising might be. And you could imagine a case where, well, there's a lot of people who are chosen to identify themselves in racist ways on Facebook, and it may be that advertising doesn't actually ever get used in a way that builds that audience, but something is odd there, right? Something seems bad. And it seems like it's bad because the system is set up to make it so easy to do that without any kind of intervention. And hence, you need some explanation that isn't about the wrong that's going to happen in the world to people, but, somebody not kind of minding the store, so to speak. So I think that's the thing, is there's cases where there might be wrong actions without clear cases of harm or undermining well-being. That's not to say that system doesn't also have those effects, but I think that the explanation for the wrongness there doesn't depend upon the existence of those wrong effects. And I think that's what we're trying to, that's how we came to this kind of
so it's like creating a system that affords possibilities for harms rather than actually setting out to commit harms yourself.
Yeah, and they might not even be harms. We'll talk about that a little bit. Yeah. So wrongs is maybe the way I would put it. And I think there's a lot like that. I think there's a lot of cases. So after this article, and this article is part of a book that Clinton, Adam, and I wrote, and we started to think about agency and autonomy in different ways that those, just call them goods, for lack of a better word, those kind of goods interact with information technologies. And it interacts not only because people who are agents might be affected, might be wronged, they can also affect the conditions under which people's agency develops. and they may undermine the degree or affect the ways in which agents actually dispense with their responsibilities. So, here's this technology, and the way that Facebook or others, and we talk about different entities in this paper, dispense their responsibilities is mediated by this technology. And we talk about the responsibilities of citizens within democratic polities and the way that automated systems and potential misinformation can put a drag on our ability to actually exercise our agency, which underwrites democratic legitimacy. And that may be true even if no particular electoral democratic outcomes is affected, right? So that the exercise of agency, the exercise of moral agency, in addition to moral patienthood, is an important piece of this whole picture, if that makes sense. You look like maybe I didn't explain that as clearly as I could have.
No, that's really interesting and something that we're trying to address in this class in particular, because the theme of the class is contemporary issues in applied ethics, and we're kind of using trustworthiness as a guiding stream. And I think it's clear that, like, when you're interacting with a political system and you don't trust it to respond to you as a constituent in the ways that it ought to, then you're going to behave in ways that are problematic. Like, I mean, I'm just thinking about the difference between the US and Australia in this regard. Like, here in Australia, voting is mandatory, right? Whereas in the US, people on the right wing try to make it hard for people to vote, especially people of color and poor people and so on. And that kind of thing makes it harder to trust the outcomes of the political decisions that are made through the democratic voting process. So you might think, like, part of what's going on here is, like, do we create systems that foster trust or systems that foster distrust? And if we create systems that foster distrust, that's going to lead people to reasonably engage in behaviors that they wouldn't otherwise do.
Right. And yes, that's great. I love it. I've started reading a little bit more on trust and trustworthiness, and it's fascinating. I'm not quite ready to articulate sort of what my views are there, but that sounds exactly right. And I think that fits with kind of what partly in the laundering case, but partly in this other sense of talking about moral agents is, even if somebody is reasonably acting in a way that is based on this lack of trustworthiness, that's a way in which their agency is undermined, right? That's an infirmity of, what's an infirmity of? I want to be careful here. That is an infirmity of some sort, and it undermines people's ability to act responsibly, to discharge their responsibilities within a society, right? If they're put in that position. Doesn't mean that they're blameworthy there, but there's this thing that is important that call it democratic legitimacy, and that's a contested concept, but it depends upon people being able to be able to exercise their agency effectively, right? And so you need to think of them as agents, not just as people who have been wronged, but as people who have this bigger role that they engage in by exercising their agency. In fact, this is a nice stuff too. I might want to write a paper about the intersection there. That's a good idea.
Cool. I mean, so I guess this takes us to the next question that I sent to you, which is, like, in the paper, the main moral wrong that you diagnose is what you call agency laundering. And I mentioned this term to Karen Jones last week when I interviewed her, and she loved it. I sent her your paper. Um, but I think it's a really useful concept. So I'd like to ask you, like, how exactly do you define it? And why do you think it's an important concept for diagnosing the wrongs that are committed, um, either in bureaucracies in general or specifically in the context of algorithmic decision making?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a sort of a longer and technical definition that I'll brush over. Just I don't think that'll come across, that's a very text-based, the article's text, and it's easier to go over it a couple times. But so I'll give a gloss on it and then talk a little bit more informally. And if you see my eyes darting around, it's because I want to make sure that I don't botch it. So
I'm sure you know what your own concept is.
Yeah, exactly. So the definition is that it's a case where some person has moral responsibility within some domain, right? That might be your responsibility, Mark, as a professor in a class, right? There's lots of moral responsibility that you have in that class to do it effectively, to not, arbitrarily fail students. And I'm sure you dispense with all of those conscientiously. But you might also ensure that some other thing intervenes, something intervenes or functions in your carrying out your responsibility in that domain. Maybe you use Turnitin. Do you have Turnitin in Australia? I'm sure that
we do use Turnitin. We use it obsessively.
You use it what?
Obsessively.
Oh, obsessively, yeah. So Turnitin is an automated system that sort of, captures places where student work might mirror or mirror closely other student work or work out there on the web, right? Automated system. And you might just insert that into your grading process, right? You score a certain, I'm betting you don't do it quite like this, but you might just say, if your score is above or below a certain thing, you get points or you get points taken off.
Oh my God, no.
No, I know you don't. I know you don't.
What a horrible thing to do.
Well, yeah, I got to define this. We want a case of clear,
Yeah, I know exactly why this would be terrible. So, but go on.
Yeah. So now you might, in so doing, you're not just gonna do that. I mean, well, if you're doing it this way, you might do it. You might. Anyway, one might, when you do that, ascribe what we call morally relevant attributes. Like when you're doing that, you're saying, look, this is a pretty darn well calibrated tool. It's going to pick up similar language. That's morally relevant, and it's going to capture certain kinds of I don't want to call it wrongdoing, certain kinds of student writing that needs changing. It's going to capture something important there, right? Obviously it captures, has lots of false positives, and it's not a good pedagogical tool in many ways. There's lots of problems with it, but you're implicitly, or you're implicitly ascribing certain morally relevant attributes. And in doing that, in putting this tool in there as part of the causal responsibility for what comes out of your grading system, right? It's causally responsible, not morally. This machine can't be morally responsible, but it's causally responsible. That is, it's part of the explanation of how a student grade turns out. By inserting that there and by doing this kind of ascription of morally relevant qualities, you are failing to adequately account for things within your domain of teaching for which you are morally responsible, right? You sort of obscured it. You've outsourced this I want to be careful about using too many metaphors here, but you've outsourced this process. You inserted this this thing into the causal chain, and at the end of the day, you'd be like, look, lo and behold, Turnitin gave this measure, and it's a good tool. And I'm not the one who thought about Turnitin or implied that I thought about Turnitin and used it to make grading a little easier for me, and failed to actually go back and look at positive marks, or even whatever, looked at the actual outcomes, thought about them, possibly engaged in other pedagogical behaviors where students might not have known what the whole process was, or maybe the language is common language, or whatever it is, right? So you've kind of obscured your role there. You've obscured what's going on. And in so doing, you've made it harder for students to kind of ask for an account, right? They might ask, well, look, I'm a student, I want to learn, I want to do this, I'm trying to write well. And you say, well, there's this system that showed that you're copying language from somewhere else. And so you've made it harder for them to ask for the right kind of account for what's going on in this process, right? Now, there may be problems with that example, like it might not be exactly as neat as the one that's in the paper, but that might resonate with with students.
Yeah. Well, I think that's actually a really nice example, because Turnitin, it'll pick up things like citations. So if you have a citation that is properly formatted, that will show up as plagiarism, right?
Yep.
If you have a quotation, that will show up as plagiarism. So if you go by a simple score of like what % of the paper is recognizable from previous work, then students who are quoting stuff will get penalized, which is stupid. Obviously, if they're stealing it and not putting it in quotation marks, that's a problem. But that's something we can talk about, and not something that this kind of automated system picks up on very well. And I feel like this is an issue that crops up not just in student essays, but all across the board, like when you're applying for a loan, or when you're trying to get out of prison, or all kinds of other issues. So, these tools are cool, they're fun. It's great that there are nerds who want to work on them. But the boundary conditions under which they're applicable are much narrower than they're often used in, and people do seem to want to just sort of grab onto them and say well, it's not my fault. The system said that you plagiarized, so now you're on the hook, and I don't have to give an explanation for myself.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And it's probably they can be very seductive in that way. I know that you've written on that. I don't think it's exactly what you mean in that paper, but they do kind of have this thing where Turnitin can capture stuff that we actually care about, and it's sort of seductive to think, oh, it's doing this work that often took me a long time, and then to just kind of let it run. Yeah. And that's and in so doing obscure sort of what your role is in these processes.
Yeah, I mean, so one question that I had was is this something that's specific to computerized algorithms, or is this something that we also see in bureaucracies? Does agency laundering occur all across the board, and it's just that we're seeing it more in computerized algorithms now because they're so cheap if you implement them at scale?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm not. I'll give you my general view. My general view, and I'm just going to state it baldly. It's probably false, but I think that that a gigantic proportion of the kind of moral problems and social problems that we see in the context of technologies, and particularly new information technologies, are not really that much about the technologies themselves. And so you mentioned bureaucracy. I think bureaucracy is a huge one. And I mean, bureaucracy is probably a technology, right? I would identify bureaucracy as a technology. old.
It's not a computing technology.
It's
in the
not a
same
computing technology.
way.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And so, and I think that, automated systems or algorithmic systems make salient a lot of problems that probably exist, and they might actually make it easier to kind of see where they happen, because oftentimes they're tools that are used in a very similar way in lots of very related contexts. So, I think the bureaucracies certainly do it. I think that you could even argue that inserting people into systems is a way, making something less technological is a way of laundering. So there's a couple of interesting papers. Let me make sure I get the names right. Madeline Ellis and Ben Wagner. Ellis just talked about what she calls moral crumple zones, where humans are the sort of the fall people for moral problems that are in technological systems, and Wagner talks about how humans inserted into the loop of a bigger automated process where they don't actually have time to act fully, to incorporate information, deliberate, act, can be a way to kind of launder the responsibility of the people building the bigger system that may create problems, and point to some person that's in the loop as the blameworthy entity, right? So you could imagine an automated car, a driverless car that has a human there that can intervene at the right moment, but they really can't because they have to pay attention, and that's hard, or maybe the reaction time is a human just can't do it very well. But when there's a crash, then it's like, well, the human didn't actually intervene, but someone building that larger integrated system should know better, right? So I haven't analyzed that strictly in terms of agency laundering, but you can see how it doesn't necessarily go to the technology launders. It could be that human action launders more responsibility for some kind of bigger integrated system.
Right. I mean, so that actually connects with like this scandal that's come up with Tesla recently. I'm not sure if you've heard about this. So
always down to hear about a good scandal.
So apparently there's a large number of cases that are now under investigation where Tesla autopilot turned off approximately 500 milliseconds before a crash, and that enabled Tesla to say that it was drivers who were to blame.
Oh, holy shit, yeah.
So I need to say, I don't know whether this is fully substantiated. It's clear that we know that the autopilot did turn off, but like, was it designed to turn off in order to protect Tesla's autopilot from blameworthiness is a totally other question, which I'm not in a position to answer, and no one I think is right now. But like, if it turned out that is how they designed it, like if the autopilot saw there was going to be a crash, it would revert to driver control in order to make the driver to blame. That would be a very clear case, I think, of the kind of agency laundering that you have in mind here.
I think so. Though the bigger wrong may just be outright fraud. Sometimes it's like laundering sort of may understate the problem there.
Fair enough. Yeah. Okay. So I guess the idea then is that like there are various ways in which people can disguise their agency, either by routing it through computers, or routing it through other people, or routing it through systems, or some combination of those, and that this is a way of sort of getting yourself off the hook. And it seems to me that like this happens a lot, and it's not something new. In a way, it's obvious when you start to look at it in the algorithmic context, but it's the sort of thing that I mean, people have been trying to get themselves off the hook since they were people who were on the hook, right?
Right.
So the question is like, what's new here?
Yeah, maybe nothing. I don't think there's a new phenomenon, certainly. And I don't want to collapse agency laundering from just simple deception, right? Covering your tracks or destroying evidence, after the fact may be slightly different. Just simple deception. I don't want to imply that all deception is a form of agency laundering. I want to get at something that's a little bit about just more about people setting up structures that insulate them ahead of time, and not just insulate them ahead of time, but insulate them from ultimately providing an account of what their actions amount to, what they're doing and why, what their reasoning is. Like there's all kinds of ways in which you might hide action just of wrongdoing. Like you rob a bank, you're not necessarily laundering what you do when you hide evidence, but rather if you, it's more about if you set up a system where it's easy for people not to make claims against your account, and they just, because there's a lot of drag in a system. I'm not describing this very well, but setting up something where you actually are responsible for the bigger structure, and it doesn't look that way. I think that's the kind of thing that I'm trying to capture. It's not a new phenomenon, no, but I'm trying to integrate this agency of the person doing the action and its relation to the agency of people who are affected or who have an interest in the way that action unfolds. And I think maybe that's what's new, or maybe that's what's articulated here. Maybe, but again, maybe not.
No, I think I see what you're saying. So like, for instance, here at Macquarie University, we recently had this dashboard instituted that sort of ranks all of us against each other based on our publications and our grants and various other things. And it was meant to be like a nice quick tool for administrators to use when they were deciding who to promote when. And then, of course, the pandemic, you may have heard of it. And we went through several rounds of redundancies where people were losing their jobs. And this was used to rank people against each other and say like, well, you're great and all, but like this other person who's in your department is better than you. So maybe you don't belong here anymore. And it was like, well, but that's just what the algorithm said. It's not me, the dean, who is saying you're shit and you deserve to lose your job. It's just that, the numbers speak for themselves and you don't belong here. I think this is the kind of thing that you maybe have in mind.
Yes, it is. And I'm going to say that that's a not great, it's a terrible case, but it's an illustrative case. It's a very, very it's an illustrative case, not just of agency laundering. So in the book, right? So we talk about as I said earlier, we divide it into three, the ways in which automated systems can affect people, the conditions of agency and responsibilities of agents. We actually talk about the conditions under which systems like that are justifiable or not. We do have teacher evaluation systems as a case study there. So the wrongs there include things like reliability. Is this actually a good measure? People have different kinds of publications, people have different life circumstances and so forth. Is it actually showing anything? What does it say about, what does it imply about the ways in which people are responsible? It sort of seems to be implying that people responsible for, what their dashboard score actually is. It's often, not the case. I mean, in the pandemic, people were affected differently, for example. And then what the stakes are, right? I mean, you can imagine the big shift here, the biggest shift here is kind of the shift from a low stakes, or not, it's not even low stakes, but a lower stakes, who's going to get the bonus or the promotion, or, maybe it's just a friendly competition, and people want to look a little better on the dashboard to the external world, and there's not really any, repercussions, to like very high stakes, losing a job. That's so that sort of suite of things is the things that matter for justifiability here, and the fact that this wrong is happening against a background we've inserted a tool into the causal chain of who stays, who goes, is a way in which that bad process is laundered. So there's sort of a multi-part, like this could have been a case study that would run through the book. Sadly.
Right. So it's like, I'm not firing you, the system is firing you.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
That's just the way things go. And that's how it works. Yeah. Okay, so I don't want to talk too much about my own university. So I guess the next question I wanted to ask was about this Latin that you got in the paper, because I barely know any Latin, and not all of my students know Latin. So in your definition of agency laundering, you distinguish between de jure and de facto power. So can you spell out what that distinction means, at least in this paper? Because it seemed to me that you didn't mean de jure to mean only what's authorized by constitutional or statutory law,
Right.
but also by like official or recognized procedures. And so I wanted to know a little bit more, like exactly how this distinction is meant to work in the paper.
Yeah, so I'll answer that, but I'm also gonna punt a little bit. So yeah, you're right. So by de jure power, I mean, like you said, not just statutory law or constitutional law or something like that. I mean, I'm sure you are, but your students may not be. What law is actually controversial, and HLA Hart outlined this structure of what law is, and one of the key things of what a law is simply a rule of recognition. It's a social fact about what people recognize as having a kind of power, right? They will look at something and recognize that this is the rule book, right? Or this is the rules by which we play here. And that's the sense of de jure power. So within an organization, you might have bylaws. Within an academic department, you have rules by which people get promoted, or rules by which students can get a degree, or who can do what. And that's a kind of de jure power, in the sense that people recognize it. People will tend to act in a way that respects it, that is, will abide by the terms, at least under most conditions, that are abide by the ways in which that's exercised. And de facto,
like commonly recognized expectations, obligations, responsibilities, and so on.
Yes, that's
Okay.
right. Yes, absolutely. Okay. And de facto is, I mean, something more like what's going to happen on the ground, independent of de jure power, right? So you might have a particularly in a department, just we're academics, so I'll just use academic departments as an example, because it's familiar. You might have a particularly strong personality. Maybe it's a negative thing, maybe it's a positive thing, but they're just maybe they're a jerk, and you don't want to, you don't want to deal with it. And so They have certain responsibilities, but who's going to hold them to account for it because it's more difficult than it's worth. And they kind of have a de facto power to not exercise responsibility, even if they have a de jure obligation to do so. That's the distinction that I'm talking about. And in the case of, take something like an automated system that functions within a criminal justice system to assess risk of people who are defendants or have been charged with some crime. This automated system has no de jure power, right? No, they're individual people or groups of people that have power there, but they might insert this tool and abide by what it does. So it has actual effect, even if no one outside, no one else would actually recognize it as having its own obligations and responsibilities. That's the distinction that in the version of agency laundering that you've got there, we've updated the view. Like we agree that it's a little obscure there. I don't think it's wrong, but I think it's better. Actually, what I'll say is that folks at Dell have got me thinking about concepts of responsibility a little more deeply. And so we've changed it to causal and moral responsibility. So causal responsibility is a kind of de facto, right? It has an effect. Moral responsibility is a little bit more than de jure. It's not just a rule of recognition, but it's having both a capacity and a role obligation within some set of circumstances. So we've sort of shifted the emphasis in different versions of agency laundering that we've put out there.
Cool. Well, it's useful, I think, for the students to see that all of this is work in progress. Like,
yeah,
none of us ever arrives at the one true view, and part of this is, the discussion and conversation and negotiation with other clever people who care about things, and that's part of the process.
Yeah, and in fact, just sitting down and talking to you, right? That's part of it too. Is like, wow, makes me rethink things again, and hopefully, write some more about maybe the link between laundering and trustworthiness, or whatever the concepts are. So yes, it always is a work in process and work in progress, and hopefully other people will explain why we're wrong and modify views accordingly. Yeah,
cool.
Helpful.
Well, so as I understand it, your main kind of moral objection to agency laundering rests on respect for persons, kind of Kantian point, but both respect for persons as epistemic agents and as practical agents. And you say that people, I'm going to quote this, have a claim to make sense of important facets of their lives. And that an important part of this kind of sense making is understanding why those facets might have changed. So when someone experiences such a change, and it's obscured by agency laundering, either through a bureaucracy or through an algorithm or both, they aren't in a position to understand what happened to them. And this means that they're not in a position to reverse the change if they really don't like it. Is that an accurate summary of the main objection to agency laundering, or is there more going on with agency laundering that you think is also problematic, even when this kind of explainability is not at stake?
I think that's a very good summary, generous summary. I'm going to truncate it a bit because it's not necessarily about reversing things that people find disagreeable. That's often a part of it, but not necessarily. I think that's sometimes it's just a matter of providing an account, which, if changing something is important, then the account will be, part of that. But it's not always the case that something that's disagreeable warrants a change, right? We disagree with lots of things, and sometimes that's just, we're not justifiable in doing so, or maybe possible, or things
Right.
like that.
Okay.
But yes.
Yeah, no, I can see that. So at least when the decision is wrong, you want this kind of reversibility, but sometimes the decision is actually right. Maybe I'm just like so skeptical of these systems now that I tend to think they're often wrong. And that those are the cases that I focus on.
Fair point.
But yeah, so in any event, it seems like your criticism is kind of tied to what's sometimes called the right to explanation. And this is a legal right, at least arguably partially, in the European Union, in the GDPR, I think in Argentina, not so much in the United States or Australia. What do you think of the relationship between the legal right to explanation on the one hand, and these kinds of harms that we've been talking about on the other hand?
Yeah, so it's complicated. Go figure. So I'm not a fan of the nomenclature here. I tend to be pretty pragmatic and think that, look, a right to explanation gets us down the right road, and it's very hard to create a legal structure that will capture, what I think is actually all and only the things I think are morally important. So I don't want to criticize the right to explanation per se, or as it exists as a legal right, but I think it misses something, or I think that a fair amount of the scholarship on it kind of misses the mark in a way. So what I mean by that, and that's probably harsher than I mean it to sound. I don't mean it harsh at all. I just mean that there's
go hard.
Well, this thing, there's always
it's more interesting for my students if you go hard.
Yeah, right. I could take a little hate mail. A lot of the scholarship in the right to explanation has gone down the path, especially in legal fields, like what exactly counts as an explanation here? Is it kind of factual explanation, and is it something else? Abilities, what exactly is it? Do you have to be, look under the hood of code of some kind of thing? And it focuses kind of on the concept of explanation and it's and the legal life of the concept of explanation, right? There's, again, not everybody, and I haven't sort of done a content analysis of all the scholarship, but a lot of the stuff that I've read has sort of left me wanting something else. And I think that really what I care about, or I think is more important here, is different facets of agency, right? So, and you hinted at this in some of your earlier questions, right? I think that what's important is sometimes the ability to exercise epistemic agency, right? To understand better, to know what's going on, right? That's one discrete thing. Sometimes it's not that at all. Sometimes it's about exercising practical agency. So take the case of a risk analysis tool used in a criminal justice system. A particular defendant. So if I were charged with crime and I had a certain risk score, I'm not sure I actually care about the epistemic side of agency here so much as I care about a representative of mine being able to exercise practical agency in defending my case, right? So what's important for me epistemically may be very different from what's important for me practically, right? Mounting a defense is different than since a practical agency, epistemic agency is something different. They may overlap, but not necessarily. Or you take your evaluation system at your university. Maybe what's really important is not your understanding of it. but maybe, I don't know what the labor situation is there. Maybe you have a union, and maybe it's the ability of a collective bargaining unit to kind of exercise some agency there. It's practical. It's not about individual epistemic agency. Moreover, I think in some cases it's neither. I think in some cases it's about exercising democratic agency. So here's an example that you're probably familiar with. There's a paper by Obermeyer a few years ago that came out in Science about a health management system that moved patients in high-risk groups towards more managed care. Right, it implemented a machine learning system that tried to pick up on what members of this organization were going to be moved into more managed care and hopefully have better outcomes. As it turned out, that for a Black patient to be moved into the high-risk group, that is more managed care, they needed to be sicker than white patients, right? So that meant that white patients were better off, that comparatively better off than at the same level of health, the same number of chronic conditions as a similarly situated Black member.
I mean, so these things are so complicated because, like, we also see in the US that Black folks are less affected by the opioid epidemic because they have not been overprescribed opioids to the same extent that white folks.
Oh my God, yeah.
Right, so like sometimes like getting neglected by the medical system is to your advantage.
Sure.
Crazy.
I mean, yes, there is a built-in assumption here that this managed care was just more physician contact, and so hopefully it lead to more prescription. Inappropriate prescription of opioids or failure. But the point here is that there's a lot of people who have an interest in this, not because they're affected by it. I'm not in that health organization. You're not. And I don't need to exercise any practical agency. There are people who do. But like, look, health and healthcare is a huge issue in our democratic polity here. And I, who am not directly affected, have some claim to exercise democratic agency, even in those cases. So the right to an explanation there wouldn't apply. I'm not affected, but there is this agency interest that I actually have. So right to explanation doesn't capture the morally salient things that I think are really operating here. Some of it's epistemic agency that does seem to sort of capture it, but some of it's practical agency. Some of it is this, what I'll call democratic agency. Which isn't a great term because it's not necessarily about democracy. It may just be about society broadly, regardless of
political agency or something.
Yeah, something like that. Social agency.
If you can track down a paper or two that refers to that and send them to me, I'd be happy to send them to my students as well.
It's the book. It's
okay, the book. Yeah. Okay, well, if you don't mind,
it's open access. It's open access.
It's open. Awesome. Just send me the link.
I will.
Awesome.
Oh, it might also be in a paper, but it doesn't matter. I'll send you the links. Definitely.
Cool. Okay, so I realize that I'm taking a lot of your time, but I have a few more questions if you don't mind.
I'll stay. I'll stay. This is you said I meant when you introduced me, you said I'm director of a school. I have many bureaucratic things that I need to attend to, so I just as soon put those off.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'll help you with that. So your criticism of agency laundering also seems to be connected to what Suresh and I have called this right to recourse. And we didn't come up with this phrase right to recourse, but the basic idea with recourse is that when someone is adversely affected by an algorithmic or bureaucratic decision-making process, they're typically owed some kind of explanation of the decision that functions as a recipe for getting it reversed. And sometimes maybe they don't actually have a good reason to get it reversed, but sometimes they do. And that's why they're owed this recipe. Would you say that agency laundering would be less problematic if we just ensured that people had a right to recourse, even if agency laundering were going on in the background?
Yes, but yeah, I think that's got to be right, because I mean, agency laundering is going to be worse where people are harmed and do have some claim to a change. So absolutely, and I think that, you know, it's important here maybe to just address head on the fact that agency laundering may be just part of the game. It may not be where the moral action is in a lot of cases, right? I mean, where people are actually harmed, that's the worst thing than the fact that somebody is laundering their agency in that case. And so, you know, if you have recourse for the harm, then the laundering part might either be taken care of as part of that recourse, or kind of may pale in comparison. But that's not always the case, right? So it's not obvious to me who has recourse in the Facebook advertising case, right? You know, it's just a case of really smarmy action, and no individual might have actually been harmed there. Though, I don't know, there's also the fact that it's a toxic kind of platform. So I'm not sure, right? But there are cases where the harm isn't obvious and there may not be recourse, but laundering is still important. So the recourse case is going to take care, where it's applicable,
right,
is going to take care of a lot of the big pictures, is the most important stuff, but it may not take care of everything. And there may not always be recourse even when there's bad action.
right. So when you have cases where people are exposed to risks that don't actually eventuate, then
Yeah.
they don't actually have any recourse, or well, it's more difficult for them to exercise recourse because they can't say like, this bad thing happened to me, undo it.
Yeah.
Rather merely, I was exposed to this risk. It didn't actually happen, but it shouldn't have happened. That I shouldn't have been exposed in the first place.
Right.
Right. I won't say what I think about Mark Zuckerberg. Okay. So I have two more questions for you, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So the next one is, this is actually a Facebook example about enabling housing discrimination using proxy variables. And this really made my blood boil, because it's essentially just reinstituting redlining with a few tricks from computers. And Sandberg's response to this, when she was talking to ProPublica, was especially upsetting. So, I mean, it often seems that the problem with these companies is that they can just get away with things because they are monopolies. And it's nothing really to do with algorithms. It's just the fact that algorithms make it possible to create these monopolies, then in turn means that the people who have power over the monopolies abuse it, which of course they do, because everyone who's ever had power over a monopoly abuses it. So in a way, I wonder, like, have we as researchers focused on the wrong problem? Is the problem really more like political and economic, as opposed to anything to do with anything that computer scientists study?
Yeah. So this is a great question. And I'm sympathetic in a lot of ways. Though my ability to exercise imagination may be what's limiting me here. Let me explain what I mean by that. So yeah, you know, take that Obermeyer insurance case, you know, that managed care system case. You know, if it were true that healthcare in the US was much more widely available, and health disparities weren't what they are, then that kind of automated system doesn't look as bad. There's these other political structural facts, background facts. Background doesn't mean they're lesser facts, just they exist already before this system is in place. Then yeah, well, it's not really a computer system, it's this other stuff. That's got to be true. And likewise with Facebook. I mean, partly it's monopolistic, partly it's just stickiness of platforms, partly it's the bad action on the part of people who are offering housing, and they can, so it's sort of the kind of relative power of landowners versus non. And yeah, that's all true. I think that any one of these problems really depends upon a bunch of other social, economic, historical, and legal facts that create the conditions in which it operates. I think that's absolutely right. But what I'll say is that how do I put this? It's not obvious that the background facts do enough of the explanation, right? I mean, you need to sort of pick out the particular background facts and explain how they interact with actions and platforms that are more local and whatever unfolding now, right? So those background facts are going to unfold in different ways, right? So at time t0, moving to time t1, they're going to unfold in different ways, and they can unfold in better or worser ways. And some of the worser ways in which they're unfolding are mediated by these technologies. There's other possibilities. Maybe our energy should be spent on the power of renters to litigate or something else. There may be more effective action. That's very possibly true. I don't know, but one place where these background facts are converging, what does this mean? Converge, where they're converging is in these technologically mediated spaces. Yeah, so I mean, I kind of agree, but that doesn't mean that that these technologies aren't one place that we can look and
no, I think that's on the right track. I mean, my group has done a bunch of research on Twitter and Reddit and YouTube and so on, and in part it's like easy to diagnose problems on the big platforms because you can get a shitload of data. But then if you step back and ask yourself, like, wait, is this more of a problem than I would have found if I had done harder work looking at offline spaces? You suddenly become very unsure of whether like the fact that it's on the internet is the issue, or just you could find it on the internet easily and that's what you did.
Yeah, I mean, I think, right. I mean, that may be something that we could in principle figure out, but in practice can't, right? Because as you say, looking at other places is super, super hard, and it all unfolds at a rate that maybe outpace our ability to figure stuff out. I will say that, there's a friend of mine here at UW who he did his dissertation probably over 20 years ago, looking at early kind of social media, bulletin boards and listservs and things like that. And, this was back in the day when people like, I'm blanking on the names, but you would recognize them. You know, we're talking about the democratic possibilities of the internet and how everybody's going to listen to each other more and be, you know, much more friendly with each other. And his earlier was like, no, that's just not what's happening, is that people can find critical masses to kind of develop, you know, to go different directions. And so, you know, there's some combination, right? That the internet didn't cause people to have odious views or, you know, fringe anti-democratic or racist views or whatever. Sure, obviously that's not the case, but the way it unfolds, because so much of our communication is now in these technologically mediated spaces, the way it unfolds is largely happening in these online spaces. So you can't blame the technology, but you can think about its causal role in doing the work. And I think that kind of takes us back to agency laundering. There's this causal thing that's happening. The moral responsibility encompasses the causal part, but it's more than that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And the genie is not going to get put back in the bottle.
Nope.
Nope.
Yeah.
Especially, you know, after the pandemic, it's just,
Yeah.
This is what we're doing now. If you don't mind, I'll ask you one more question.
Sure. Yeah.
So towards the end of the paper, you argue that the use of compass in the Loomis case doesn't actually count as agency laundering because the judges were warned not to base their decisions solely on what the algorithm told them. And yeah, I admit that they were told that, but like, I know what people do with defaults. Like when you're given a default, you're usually just going to follow it unless you get a red flag and you're like, wait a second, what's going on? And, you know, we're dealing with similar kinds of things here in Australia. There's this system that's been used called Vera 2R, which was developed in the Netherlands to make decisions about parole for convicted terrorists. And it's been used to keep people in prison, essentially, even though it's not actually meant for terrorist cases. It's meant for just violent criminality in general.
Yeah.
So it's being used outside of its training domain. And I just, when I see these kinds of examples, I feel like people who are using these systems generally are not computer scientists. They're judges, they're bankers, they're whatever they are. They get given a tool that tells them, here's the best decision you can make. And there's a bunch of math in the background that you don't understand. And they look at something that is probably going to leave them uncertain, even if they don't have that tool ready to hand. And that tool is generally going to just sway them reasonably, even. Like they're not making dumb decisions by saying like, well, I'm not sure what to do here. The tool says X or the tool says Y. I go with that because I have nothing else. So to me, it seems like, yes, in some sense, we don't have agency laundering here because they do have access to other evidence and they are explicitly told not to just blindly trust the tool. But on the other hand, the evidence that they've got is ambiguous and uncertain. And this is like presented as a thing that is at least somewhat reliable. So it would be kind of stupid not to use it. So what makes you think that like this is actually not agency laundering? Sorry, this is a bit of a challenging question, but like I actually think that this is agency laundering.
Okay. So failure to adequately exercise agency, I think, is different than agency laundering. I maybe this is my gut, right? I didn't actually like our conversation here and the way I hear the question now is a little different than I thought before we're going in. This is actually good. This is helping me clarify what I think. So my gut here is that exercising agency is different than laundering one's agency. So I agree that in the case that you're describing, so we're not talking about this judge is who knows, right? This judge may have actually just gotten this in the Loomis case that we described. Maybe this judge has got the pre-sentence investigation report that had the Compass report in it, didn't really pay that close attention, and actually, just really did exercise agency in this case. But as you point out, there's no way that's gonna be the rule, right? Everybody's busy. Everybody responds to prompts, right? There's always a framing thing that a system like this will set up. Just as a psychological fact, we're going to tend to react to that kind of framing setup, right? So some judges will probably let's just speculate totally reasonably that they'll start using a system like this as a substitute for their own kind of deliberative judgment, right? That, I think, is plausibly a failure to adequately exercise agency and hence responsibility in those kinds of cases. Why isn't it agency laundering? Agency laundering is about offering reasons. So what the court did, so in the Wisconsin v. Loomis case, the trial court, that is the court that sentenced the defendant here, got a Compass report, but at the same time ran through a number of reasons that the judge said, look, X, Y, and Z are why you, defendant, are getting this sentence. I am making the decision based on these factors that you are getting this decisions, and laid it out fairly substantially. And the Wisconsin Supreme Court said, whoa, you got to do that. You have to be the one that is providing an account of what the outcome is, and not pretend that it's some other thing that's doing the work. And so I think that, the laundering is about this not embracing one's moral responsibility and attributing cause responsibility to the other system. And if a judge points to the Compass system, points to a similar risk assessment system, and says, yeah, that's the reason, that looks like agency, that is agency laundering in my view. But if they take the Compass view and then actually put themselves on the line and offering reason, they may be deceived. They may be deceived about what they're actually doing. Sure. Yeah. But I think that they're sort of putting themselves as the responsible agent in that case. That's
Okay. Okay. Yeah. No, that's actually a really helpful distinction. And as you say, like, it can happen that someone thinks that they're putting themselves on the line, but they're really just adopting what's been given to them as a default. Though, as we've also seen in the last week, nudges and other defaults are maybe not as powerful as they've been portrayed by economists for the last 25 years or so. So maybe that's less to worry about.
Yeah, let's see some replications and all, we'll see the afterlife of that.
Everything is a mess. Okay. Alan, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. If my students have any questions, do you mind if I refer them to you?
No, that'd be great.
Fantastic.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun. I don't get enough time to talk about these things, and with a interlocutor like yourself that has their own deep research expertise and interests here. It's always fun, and
their own bunny robe.
Yeah, very, very cool. I wish I could wear that in the office. I mean, I guess I could wear it in the office. I'm direct, right? Nobody's gonna
you can do what you want.
Right.
Cool. Thank you so much, Alan.
Yeah, great to catch up. Great to see you. And I'll send you a couple links and we'll chat more.
Terrific. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Right. Yeah.